All right, look. This first storyteller. Got a lot to say about him. About 3 months ago, I was scrolling on Instagram. You guys ever done that? Scroll? You know, don't do it. And I came across a picture of this gentleman. I looked closely, and there was a mustache. It was the first time I'd seen him with a mustache ever. As long as I've known this gentleman, he had a goatee. And it was like Mark Kenyon's evil twin staring back at me through the Instagram screen. But I think once you see him come out here, I see him right there. He's looking at me, hey buddy. It's like Tom Selleck and Sam Elliott had a baby. It transformed Mark Kenyon into a new person. A new man with a new power. Maybe even more powerful than Ryan Callahan, who's a veteran of the mustache. I don't know. You decide. Without further ado, mostly just the mustache, but also Mark Kenyon. Mark Kenyon!
Usually when somebody talks about me and they make the introductions about whitetails or something, that's the first with a mustache lead-in, so I don't know how to take that. So how about this? By a round of applause or hoot and holler or something like that, how many of you guys like to chase whitetails? All right. Well, then I'm going to tell a fishing story. And this is actually my very first fishing story. Now I know I fished many times prior to this particular day, but no other fishing story plays out like a movie in my mind. I mean, I can see this one scene by scene by scene. I was 7 years old to the day, and I know that because it was my birthday. I was turning 7 on this particular day. And I gotta tell you, I can only remember 2 things from my 7th year on Earth. One is this fishing story I'm about to tell you. And I guess, hell, we just started. Why not confuse things? I'll tell you the other story too. The other story. I'm 7. It's 1994. I'm in the 2nd grade and I'm wearing nylon wind pants, kind of like the MC Hammer style, for those of you guys who remember him. And my fellow 7-year-old best friend at the time, his name's Billy. We had a little pause in that day of class and Billy kind of calls me over to the corner. He gets down here and he kind of gives me this very solemn look. And he says, hey Mark, I'm not 7 years old. I'm 8. And I just lost my shit. I mean, I started crying. I stormed out of the room. I felt so betrayed. This is who I was. For context, for the fishing story, that's who I was at 7 years old, okay? So I'm 7. Here's the fishing story again. I'm 7, it's my birthday, and my grandpa is taking me fishing. Now that's not a particularly rare thing for me at that time. My grandpa took me out for a lot of days on the water in the summer. He would pick me up and go up to the cabin, but despite it not being rare, it was always, always special. You know, if grandpa was gonna pick you up for a day on your own to be outside, I knew I was in for an adventure, like a real grown man's adventure. So that's what was in store on this particular day. It was gonna be a great birthday. The first thing I remember about that day was hopping up into grandpa's car. We called him GP. GP was his way of not feeling old, I guess. He didn't like being called grandpa. So GP arrives, pulls up, I hop up into his truck. It was one of those grayish green Ford Explorers. In the 90s, they had like the Eddie Bauer edition. That's what this was. And I remember a few things that really stand out about this. And I don't know why, it's such a strange thing, but what I remember is this vehicle. You pop open the door, hop up in the front seat. The front seat, mind you, for a 7-year-old. I don't know if that's legal anymore, but it was a big deal. And the first thing you notice were the seats. Squeaky leather seats. And that would hop in and you feel that. I didn't know anybody else who had leather seats, but Grandpa did. So that was special. The second thing I would notice when you hop up into GP's car was the music. It was the kind of stuff that I didn't hear anywhere else. Kind of old-timey. Neil Diamond, Alabama, Willie Nelson, but like not the cool country Willie Nelson, but like Willie singing Frank Sinatra covers. That was what we would listen to. So there's the leather seats, there's Willie Nelson singing Frank, And then there's the smell. And the smell was Prince Albert's pipe tobacco. Does anybody know what that smells like? It is rich, earthy, pungent, and glorious. And my grandpa didn't even smoke anymore at that point. He just kept carrying around a little pipe tobacco pouch, and he kept the pipe with him, and he'd pack that thing and just kind of hold it, chew on it. And I think, just like me, he just really enjoyed the hell out of that smell. So that's what I was stepping into as this day began. GP wasn't a hugger. Like, we didn't do that. But hopping up into his vehicle and kind of being enveloped by all of that stimuli, I guess, that was kind of our embrace. So the day began. I'm feeling, I'm smelling, I'm seeing all this. And the next thing I remember was something that happened on every one of these trips we would take together. I'd say, "Hey GP, will you tell me a story?" He'd tell me a story. "Hey GP, will you tell me another story?" He'd tell me a story. "Hey, how about one more, Grandpa?" He'd tell me that one. God bless him. He humored me with story after story after story. He told me funny stories. He told me exciting stories. He told me stories that, in retrospect, I think were meant to be instructive. I remember one when he told me about how his dad never took him outside. It was his best friend's dad that introduced him to the outdoors and took him rabbit hunting. And he talked about how good those pancakes were that his best friend's mom made every time after a hunt. I remember him telling me about how he and my grandma had gone out on their honeymoon for a weekend of ice fishing. And I thought, wow, I don't know how he pulled that off. He was a genius, but he did an ice fishing weekend for his honeymoon. I remember that one. I also remember another story he told about teaching himself to bow hunt and how he'd hit a buck later on after he figured out. He hit a buck, wounded it, and was not able to recover it. And how he hung up his bow for good. And said, if I can't do it cleanly and ethically, I'm not going to do it at all. So these are the stories I heard that day and on similar days, and I would continue to ask for more and more and more and more. They were like my lifeblood. I mean, I just couldn't get enough of it. And on this particular day, I'm sure not a minute too soon, 2 hours passed, we arrived to our destination for that particular fishing trip. And where we were going was a reservoir on the Manistee River up in northwestern Michigan. Yeah, there we go. This place is called the Hoden Pile. At least I think that's what it's called. That's what we called it. And there you go. We arrived at the Hoden Pile. And I'd like to tell you that at this point, it was all fun and games, as you would think a 7-year-old's fishing trip might be. But with GP, you had responsibilities. You had to work for it. So responsibility number one was that I had to be holding my rod at exactly a 90-degree angle out from the side of the boat as we trolled up and down the shoreline for 12 hours and be focused on that rod tip as if my life depended on it. And if that sucker twitched, I better set it and reel in that fish. My second responsibility, which was supposed to be happening simultaneous to that, was saving our lives. Because you see, this reservoir was a wooded river bottom before it was flooded. So there are still now even, and at this point, 28 years ago, treetops all across this body of water that are just beneath the surface. And if we were to not know that we were coming up on one of those treetops, we'd hit it, and Grandpa frequently reminded me this would ruin our outboard, this would ruin our boat, this would ruin our day. So I was on deadhead patrol, as we called it. So, this is how that morning went. I was sitting there, stick that rod out there, focus on the rod tip, focus, 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 start daydreaming, start thinking about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or dinosaurs or how much fun second grade's gonna be, meeting other exactly 7-year-old friends, and then panic. Is there any wood? Are there any trees? Am I focusing on this? And then back to the rod, okay. Focus, 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 daydream, panic. Is there wood? Are there any trees? Are there any deadheads? Focus, 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 and slam! Like a bag of bricks to the head, I felt the weight of what had to be a fish on my arm. And at this point, I screamed. And I would like to think that what I screamed was, "Fish on, Grandpa, fish on!" But honestly, it was probably just rah, something like that. And at the exact same time, my grandpa started hollering at me. And this I do remember. I remember very clearly what he was saying. There might have been some 4-letter words in there. But it was, Mark, stop reaming on that rod. Stop pulling it. You're going to break it. You do not have a fish. You are hooked on a deadhead. And I was so sure this must be a fish. I kept railing on that thing and reaming on this rod, bending it over. And I will tell you, his concerns were not unfounded. I did find out later in life this is possible. As a teenager, fishing with my buddy Josh, who happens to be on the Michigan chapter board, is not here to defend himself, but he was fishing with me, got his lure stuck in a tree behind him, yanked on it so hard he snapped that rod right in half. It was my rod, so I remember this quite clearly. So this is possible, but at 7 years old, I wasn't thinking about that. I just wanted this fish log to be a real thing. So I'm reaming on this thing, and somehow, miraculously, I paused for a brief second. And then GP saw it. Thump, 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 thump. It was a fish. Now Grandpa started yelling about something different entirely. He says, reel it in, Mark, reel it in, reel it in. So I start reeling it in and reeling it in, and I gotta set the stage for you a little bit more. The picture, really. If any of you guys are fly fisher people, imagine one of those badass films in the fly fishing film tour. You got a guy standing on the front of the boat, he's in the ocean, he's got the raccoon eyes, sunglass, tan lines, bright blue board shorts. He's hooting and hollering and screaming. There's a 200-pound sailfish diving up and out of the water. He's got 12 weight stuck in his hip, just pulling it in. His buddies are in the back of the boat, clanking Coronas and hooting and hollering and cheering. That's the exact scene that was playing out. But take that guy out of it, and insert a 7-year-old in parachute pants, holding a little spinning reel, and the guy hollering in the background is my grandpa, kicking juice boxes out of the way, trying to get to the front to help me. Somehow this chaotic scenario ended with a fish floating up to the surface. The walleye of a lifetime. I can still see it clear as day right now. These golden green scales, that spiny dorsal fin that just seems to could rip up your hand, thick as my grandpa's thigh, and 26 inches long. Yeah. The biggest fish I'd ever seen. I think the biggest walleye my grandpa had ever seen. And somehow, this little 7-year-old had pulled this sucker up out of the water. Now, I don't remember almost anything else about the rest of that day, except one thing. After we caught that fish, Grandpa grabbed it, and he took one of those chain link stringers, threw it through the gills, and tossed it over the side of the boat. And I was petrified by this. So the entire rest of the day, mind you, I caught this fish in the morning. We were out there all day, of course, with GP. So the whole rest of the day, I just leaned over the side of the boat and stared at that fish for hours because I was so enamored with it. I couldn't imagine losing that fish. And if somehow that thing started to get off, I was going to save it. Now, fast forward 28 years to today, and I'm still feeling the ripple effects of that fish. Because that fishing story, in a way it became like my personal legend. It became my fishing story. I had caught a walleye, a 26-inch walleye. I was a man of the water. I was a man of the woods. If I could do that, what couldn't I do? And I started really to believe that. And I spent as much time as I possibly could in the woods, in the rivers, in the lakes, catching frogs, turtles, fish, whatever. And I fell madly, deeply in love with these things. Wild places, wild things. So much so that every year, more and more and more, I spent increasing time exploring these things, first in my home state of Michigan, then later in widening circles across the country. So much so that, now all of my recreational free time, my career, and my family's lifestyle is 100% linked to the earth, wild animals, wild waters. It's the sun that everything else revolves around. The thing is that with that increasing love for these things and increasing awareness of these things, you start to see something else too. It was Aldo Leopold who said, he said it very well, that the curse of an ecological education is living in a world of wounds. So by that, the more you pay attention, the more you love these things, the more you start realizing just how in danger that they are. Now we know that this room, probably of maybe any room in the country right now, needs to hear this less. You guys know this better than anybody. But humor me, try a few of these on for size. In the 28 years since that walleye, we've lost 1 billion acres of forest habitat across the world. 1 billion. That's all of the forest we have in America right now, wiped off the face of the earth, just since that walleye. In less than half that time, just right here in America, 50 million acres of grassland habitat gone. That's like the state of Kansas, of primo pheasant ground, whitetail ground. Out. How about here in Montana? Since that walleye, the native bull trout has disappeared from 20% of its habitat. And in my neck of the woods, the Great Lakes, a study came out recently showing that the warming river temperatures are leading to a strong probability of the native brook trout disappearing from Wisconsin from 70% of their river habitat. There's all sorts of stuff like this these days being talked about. New studies pointing to the fact that we are entering possibly the 6th mass extinction. Studies pointing to the idea that by 2100, we might be looking at 50% of all plant and animal species at serious risk of extinction. That's scary stuff. But the point that I think is the scariest is that I think for most of us, myself included, we hear a lot of that stuff, it goes in one ear and out the other. We see news headlines like that every week seemingly. Some new doomsday prediction, some new piece of bad news. And I think we get numb to it. I think we start to become immune to it. But here's the thing. We are so focused on, inflation, or Kim Kardashian, or lip syncing to trending audio on TikTok, that kind of stuff is easier just to kind of fall by the wayside. But it's not as easy once you become a parent. At least that's what I found. 5 years ago, I became a dad. Now I have 2 sons, a 2-year-old boy and a 4-year-old. And nothing tops sharing these wild things with my boys. I mean, caribou hunting in Alaska, chasing whitetails in Iowa, fly fishing the South Fork of the Snake, rafting in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. I would trade all of it, for the simple joy of being outside with my boys.
Amen.
But I'm consistently and constantly asking myself, how do we make sure that these boys and all of our kids and grandkids, how do you make sure that they have these same opportunities? I want so badly for my boys to be able to experience these same things and hopefully to love them too. How do I make sure that's possible? That's the question that I'm asking myself every morning when I wake up now. Am I doing enough to make sure that the future is a good one for these wild places? And on a more personal note, am I even good enough or qualified enough to teach them to enjoy these things the way that I was taught? Teach them how to hunt, teach them how to fish. And I gotta say, this is not helped in any way by the fact that my 4-year-old is absolutely obsessed with this guy you might have heard of named Steve Rinella. My boys watched all of his shows. He much prefers MeatEater to anything I've ever done. So much so that when I'm trying to show Everett, my 4-year-old, how to hold his bow or cast a fly rod, he will frequently, I kid you not, stop me midstream and say, no, Dad, you're doing it all wrong. Steve Rinella says to do it this way. And what do you say to that? I mean, of course Steve's right. So that's what I'm dealing with here. And all of this was on my mind just a few months ago when I was going to go on another fishing trip. This time with my son, Everett, and my dad. And we were going back to the Manistee River and the Houghton Powell Reservoir for a trip of our own. And I remember that morning, we're together, we're about to hop up in the car, and I was thinking, is Everett going to feel that same magic that I did? I mean, I didn't have the squeaky leather seats. I didn't have the pipe tobacco. Would this really be able to compare? I don't know. But there's this saying that I love. It's supposedly attributed to Mark Twain. He said that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. And in this case, pretty soon, it seemed like the clock was turned right back. And we're driving up north, and my son is asking his grandpa for a story. And then another story. And another story. And a little bit later that night, or that afternoon, we're fishing on the Manistee River for browns. And somehow my son got his hands on my rod. And pretty soon he's hollering at me that, "Yes, Dad, I'm old enough to have a full 9-foot, 7-weight fly rod with this fully articulated streamer. It's gonna be fine." And I'm hollering at him that, "No, I'm not sure you are. You're gonna hook that tree, and have I ever told you about how Uncle Josh broke my rod?" And it was that kind of thing. And you can imagine how the rest of the day went. It was amazing. It was a blast. And my son did not catch his fish of a lifetime, but he did have a story. I do remember, though, driving home that night, thinking again, does any of this matter? Is he going to remember this? I mean, he's only 4. Is he going to remember this 5 years from now? Or 10 years from now? Is this going to make a difference? Fast forward one more time. We're near water again. It's bath time. My son Everett's in his bath. I'm sitting nearby, reading a book, kind of keeping tabs on him. He's in there, he's playing with a couple dolphins, a whale, and a brown trout. And I remember noticing that things had become deathly still and quiet. And that's never a good sign with a 4-year-old. So I look over there and I see he's just sitting there looking in his hands. And he's got that brown trout in his hand. He's just staring at that fish. And then he looks up and looks me right in the eye. And he says, "Dad, can you teach me about life?" And I said, Sure, buddy, what do you want to know?" And he looked at me again. He said, "Dad, how can we save the animals?" And it was so out of the blue, so innocent, so poignant, I didn't know what to say. I did not have a good answer for him. And I'm not sure I've got a good answer now. But I think maybe the answer has something to do with that walleye and stories like that. Stories that help make us who we are. Stories that give us an identity, give us hope, give us purpose. Stories that invite others into these places with us to experience them, maybe to love them too. I read once, and this really stuck with me. I read once that the greatest argument in the world won't change a person's mind. Only a good story can do that. And so maybe that's a good place to start. Maybe we can keep telling these stories about wild things. We can keep inviting others to make those stories with us. We can do whatever the hell it takes to make more of those stories possible. Because the stories we tell define who we are. And who we are is what we love. And what we love is what we save. Thank you.
Oh, Mark Kenyon's trying to make me cry back there.